Welcome back to Going Deeper. We're moving on in our series through the book of Jude entitled Contending for the Faith. And today we're going to be moving on to Jude verse 11. Now Jude is writing in this letter to the early church, and he is begging them, urging them to contend earnestly for the faith, that body of central doctrines that makes Christianity what it is. And he's letting these early Christians know, and by extension you and I as well, that they are doing battle with false teachers. And these false teachers Jude has described for us in verse 4. Now we've seen in Jude already that he is a fan of using Old Testament examples. And there are going to be 3 more Old Testament examples that we will encounter in verse 11. 3 new examples, but the purpose is the same. The purpose is for us to be reminded that in the past, God judged unrepentant rebels in the Old Testament. To remind us that God's character has not changed, and therefore present-day spiritual rebels are going to be judged in the same way that they have been in antiquity. So as we look into verse 11, let's read this verse together and then begin to unpack it. Verse 11 simply says, "Woe to them, woe to these false teachers, for they walked in the way of Cain and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error and perished in Korah's rebellion." Now, if we were a Jewish audience, if we were steeped in the Old Testament, that would be very clear to us exactly what he is saying. Much like if someone in our modern culture wanted to use some type of offhand reference to movies that we've all seen or something. But since we are several centuries removed from the examples that he mentions, let's take some time and dig in and refresh ourselves with what's actually going on here. He starts out in verse 11 by saying, "Woe to them." And that's just a way in the Bible and in the biblical culture to express judgment and doom that is imminent. It's about to take place. Woe to them, he says. And then there's a very, very important word, for, because. Here's why judgment and doom is imminent on them. These modern day, at least to Jude's audience, false teachers were following the same errors that those in the Old Testament, these examples that he mentions here, were doing. Just the way the Old Testament examples would be judged, so would the New. He mentions first of all that they have walked in the way of Cain. Now, pretty much any time that you run across the word walk in the Bible, it's often and most times used as a metaphor. It's a metaphor for everyday life. So they have lived their lives according to the way or according to the pattern of Cain. These false teachers have followed that same path, would be another way of saying it. To understand all that this means, we really need to refresh ourselves with an understanding of who Cain was and what went down with him. So in order to do so, let's take ourselves back to Genesis 4, where we find Cain's story explained. Genesis 4, beginning in verse 1, reads this way. "Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock, and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. So the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. So That's the major portion of the story of Cain. But the crux of the story of Cain is really found in verses 3 through the beginning part of verse 5. Let's take a closer look at those verses again. So here we have this description of both Cain and his brother Abel bringing an offering to the Lord. Now that's great. To bring an offering to the Lord is an act of worship. They are both bringing a portion of what God has blessed them with. Again, that's great. Abel is bringing an offering from the flocks because he is a keeper of the flocks. Cain is bringing a part of his harvest because Cain's a tiller of the ground. He's a farmer. So far, so good. So what is it with this last part of these few verses where it says, "And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard"? What does that mean? And why did the Lord respond in that way? Well, some have interpreted these verses to mean that God had established animal sacrifice as a means of worship all the way back in Genesis 3. And therefore, animals that were sacrificed back then provided Adam and Eve after the fall with a clothing of animal skins. And they conclude that since Cain did not bring an appropriate offering, didn't bring an animal offering, that somehow God did not look upon his offering with respect. That's one way of seeing it, and perhaps that's right. I have a slightly different opinion, and I think it's based on the text, really. So let's take a look again at those verses. You see, in many ways, Cain brought an offering versus Abel bringing an offering of the firstborn, of their fat portions. There seems to be in the text there this sort of general statement that, well, Cain brought something, but Abel brought the best. Seems to me that it's not necessarily an issue so much of the substance of the offering that they brought, that one was animal flesh and another was fruit from the ground. Seems pretty clear from the verse here that it's really more an issue of the quality of the offering that reflected what was going on in their heart. Abel brought the best that he had, whether that's from the animals or whether that had been from the crops. He's bringing the best because he wants to worship God with all that he's got. But Cain is bringing what might appear to just be, well, leftovers. So there's an issue here in the heart. Abel's heart is right, Cain's heart is not. And that explains, I believe, why the offerers are mentioned prior to their offerings. He had regard for Abel, it says first, and for his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. It seems that it's more about the person and what's going on with them than what they're actually bringing. So Cain was not accepted, nor was his offering, because he diminished the importance of God in his life. And according to Jude, that's the exact same error of the false teachers in his day, and I would go so far as to say in ours as well. Now, there's really only one reason to diminish God's importance in your life, and that's because something else has taken God's place of preeminence. And that leads us to the next Old Testament example that Jude brings to mind, and that's the example of Balaam. Balaam, the son of Beor, he was a prophet during Israel's wilderness wanderings after the Exodus. He was hired by Balak, the king of the Moabites, to come and curse Israel. And Balaam, this prophet for hire, was so blinded by money that he actually attempted in the name of the Lord to go curse the people of the Lord. But each time that he stepped up to curse the nation of Israel, God changed his curse into a blessing. On the way to pronounce this great curse, the angel of the Lord stands in Balaam's way. Balaam is blind to the presence of this angel, but Balaam's donkey, you'll remember that story of Balaam's donkey, he's the one that sees the angel of the Lord and turns aside, and it's only after the Lord caused Balaam's donkey to speak to Balaam that he finally saw what was really going on. Now, one would think that after going through all of that and having your donkey straighten you out, that would change your heart. But apparently it didn't. Balaam continues on with the Moabites to go and to curse the nation of Israel. Again, each time that he stepped up to curse, God would change the words in his mouth, and they came out as a blessing. Again, one would think that would be enough for this prophet to get it right, but unfortunately not. We know from Numbers 31:16 that Balaam advised Balak, the king of the Moabites, to invite the men of Israel to a religious feast. The Moabites were going to worship Baal, and their worship of Baal, this false god, involved religious prostitution. Israel went, and from what we can see in Numbers 31, they joined in with the sinful practices of the Moabites in their idol worship, and that led to imminent and immediate judgment upon them, in which 24,000 Israelites were killed in a plague. Well, what does that have to do with what's going on in Jude 11? What was the error of Balaam? Well, it seems pretty clear that Balaam diluted God's standard of holiness in order to please Balak, the king of the Moabites, and to fill his own pockets. Now, he was, in one sense, a profiteering prophet. Now, Jude's false teachers that he is battling and that his readers are battling were really the same. They were willing to teach whatever kind of doctrine would pay the most from the audiences that would listen. Well, what exactly is that? What is it that pays the most? Giving people a religious license to live however they want has always been extremely profitable when it comes to this world's goods. What would people pay more for? A bowl of ice cream or a plate of steamed broccoli? Now, nutritionally, which would be better for them? Well, which are they going to desire more? People typically will pay more for what pleases them, even if in the end it's not what's best for them. So, rejecting the teaching of anyone who dilutes God's expectation of holiness, that's what we need to be focused on. That's what Jude is telling his audience, to contend for the faith by rejecting that diluted holy standard. In other words, if a teacher that you are listening to makes light of sin, you need to reevaluate listening to that person. If they reduce or even reject God's commandments, as some of the false teachers in Jude's day did, you need to stop listening to them. If they relegate God's unchanging truth to traditions of a bygone culture, you need to think twice about listening to them. Diluting God's holy standard was the error of Balaam that these false teachers were walking in. Now, there is another Old Testament example that we'll take a look at. But for right now, let's refocus. Here in verse 11, Jude is telling us why these false teachers of his day will be condemned. So far, like Cain, they diminish God's importance, and like Balaam, they dilute God's holy standard. But there's one more example, one more reason, and we'll get to that next time. Join me next time as we see how Jude uses some everyday metaphors to explain why we shouldn't be duped by false teachers. Thanks for joining me. Have a great day.